As you know, Building Remote Teams is a brand new podcast. And to celebrate our launch, we have some really awesome discounts to give you from some of our favorite tools for remote teams. We have discount tools for 1Password, Donut, Hey Taco, Carrot, BirthdayBot, KarmaBot, and a ton more. All you need to do is to go to buildingremoteteams.com and subscribe with your email. You'll get a link to the page with all of the recommended tools and discounts that I mentioned above. Now, on to the show. If you're working on a team, it's certain there are a lot of different personalities and communication styles that people have. The challenge with this is you have a particular communication style. And so Darrin Murner from Cloverleaf happens to be an expert in this space. So we talk about how you can deal with this as a team, understand your colleagues, and be able to work with them better when you're trying to communicate and work through issues. So listen in. Hey everyone, welcome back to Building Remote Teams. I'm here with Darrin Murner from Cloverleaf. Welcome, Darrin.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing really well now that you're here. Great. So Darrin, you run this company called Cloverleaf. Someone else had told me about it. She's incorporated into her HR consulting and she's really excited about what it is. So can you tell me a little bit about what the software does and maybe the history of where it came from?
Yeah, so we are a platform that uses tools like behavioral assessments, although we're not just restricted to or relegated to behavioral assessments, to really drive performance improvements in the team context. And we can talk a little bit more about what specifically that means. But one of the really unique things about our product and our platform is that we integrate with tools that everybody uses every day: email, calendar, Slack, Microsoft Teams. Really drive understanding, empathy, awareness of strengths, specific opportunities for roles. And so we do that by pushing coaching content out through those channels. And then what we find
Hmm.
is it actually drives behavior change and awareness over time.
So I guess what that means is you have you'll do Myers-Briggs for example on different people on the team, and then you'll see how, if Jevin's going to be working with Darrin today, it'll tell me how to best work with you. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, and so it's not just Myers Briggs. I mean, we do support Myers
Right.
Briggs and a lot of other assessments, including like DISC, and Enneagram's a really popular one right now. Strengths
Right.
Finder, all the things that we've probably all taken at least two or three times. And typically with those tools, right, you get this big giant report on yourself, and it just kind of goes in a drawer. And you're kind of like, yeah, it's good that I know those things, and oh, ha ha ha, look, that's so funny. I do that all the time. But then you're like, well, how do I actually use this in my day to day work? How does this inform? How do I communicate with other people? And how am I able to avoid conflict or work through conflict with others? Or how does this impact how I'm learning and growing my career? These are all things that we are just making really clear for individuals. And then more importantly, because we understand the team dynamics, right? We have this information about the people that are on your team. We're able to provide really focused, contextualized content about how to leverage that, understanding in the context of how you're working with each other on a daily basis.
Got it. So I have lots of software people come on, usually because the genesis of this software project has come from some core niche need that people have within a corporation. And in this case, it seems like somehow you had this reason for trying or this idea to be able to help people work better together based on their personality or their communication styles. So tell us a little bit about what does that actually mean to be able to have like what are some examples of personalities and communication styles or whatever it is that you use to be able to match people
Yeah,
up.
so I'll talk a little bit about the background or the history because I think it does, and
Mhm.
I think that was the first part of your question, which is really just kind of like how did you see this play out, and what
Right.
was the burning need to go and start a company around this? And myself and my co-founder, we worked at a digital video agency, and we did, I don't know, 35 to 40 concurrent video projects at any one time, and these video projects, 8 to 10 weeks in duration, a cross-functional team, 4 to 5 people, and people would be on multiples of these teams at any one time, right? And you're just kind of shifting gears and constantly moving in and out of these relationships with each other. It wasn't an exclusively remote team, but because most of the people were located in one of two offices. But what we saw is the dynamics on those teams really drove the outcomes of the success of the project, right? And we would have a creative director and a designer working on one project, and it could be a total failure. And we put that same designer with a different creative director, and sparks would fly, right? So one of the things we always like to talk about from a team perspective, and regardless of whether you're a remote team or you're all in the same geographic location, is there's always this sense of magic. If you've ever been on a really good high performing team, there are these moments where you're like, man, could we bottle that? And typically you don't notice it when you're in it as much as you notice it when you're out of it, right? And you're in a low
Hmm.
performing team. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is just provide transparency to that, right? Whether it was transparency for the managers and the leaders trying to staff people in these teams, or for the individuals themselves, because especially, and we happen to be a digital video agency, but you could literally plop in any sort of cross-functional team. It could be a software development team, it could be a leadership team, it could be a sales or account management team. It doesn't matter. There's still this dependency on people being able to work together to create something of high value. And unfortunately, what we end up doing is just kind of shoving people together, whether that's in the same room or, on a remote team. And we just hope that people figure it out. And I think the big thing that we really wanted to change is like, how do we help people be more strategic in this? How do we give them better information and more information faster? One of the things that we talk about a lot is the whole Tuckman's team formation model, right? So most people know of that as being the forming, storming, norming, and performing model, right? And
Right.
the whole idea
Yes.
behind that is like, hey, you put these people together. There's maybe some initial energy behind new relationships and the newness of the project, and then inevitably what happens is people start to bump up against each other, and whether it's behavioral styles that are different, or it's unclear roles or expectations, or it could be any number of factors that just start to create this inherent conflict. And that's where the
Hmm.
storming piece comes into play. And our general theory, or our general basis for our the thesis of our business, is that we got to move people through that storming process faster and make the trough not as deep, right? And if you can do that, the productivity increase over the course of that project, or that team life cycle, is going to be so much higher. You could literally look at 30, 50% improvement in productivity over the course of that project. So that's ultimately what we're
Wow.
what we're trying to do.
So, what is it about then that designer working with one creative director versus the other creative director that would make it successful or not successful? Is it just that they were the same personality types, so they got each other, or like
Yeah, well, I mean,
what was
so
it?
I think a lot of people in this space love to just be able to boil it down to, oh, you're a nine or you're an ENTJ, that kind of thing. And we're all really nuanced
Sure.
people, right? So just and
Hmm.
not only are we nuanced, but when we work with each other or we interact with each other, the level of complexity to make that relationship work and create something of high value is really complex. So we wouldn't say, oh, it's
Hmm.
just because your behavioral style, right? What we like to do is look across multiple dimensions, and it's behaviors, it's values, it's strengths, it's your skills and experience. All of that stuff has to just mix in the right ways, and ultimately, you know, come out the other end of that with a higher value product or a higher value service or a higher value delivery than what you could have
Hmm.
done without that information or without that right mix.
Sure. So break it down for me a
Yep.
bit more tactically then, because I'm a very concrete guy. So like, if you can help me figure out how in advance if it's going to work out with me and this client. Like, so,
Oh,
sometimes
totally.
there's friction, or with this team that I'm going to work with. Is there a way that I can have something in front of me? I could just email it to you, Darren. Hey, could you look at my personality? I got my client to do this particular thing, and you could be like, yo, this is not going to work. This is not. This is going to be a really tough thing. Like, are you able to see in advance the likelihood of
Yeah,
success of,
I
of a
think we can
working
point out
relationship?
some danger zones, right? Like I wouldn't say that and our
Mm,
product doesn't tell you, "Hey, don't work together," right? Just because again, because of the nuances of relationships, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't work together. It just means that here's some potential
right.
areas where you're likely to see conflict, and here's some strategies on how to work through
Mm,
that and come out the other side with not only a relationship that's intact and strong, but in a
hmm
way that has allowed you guys, the two people together or the four people together, to create something that is so much better than what you could have created on your own or what you could have created with potentially
hmm
someone else.
Nice. So, can you give me some examples of real danger zones between two different types of people, maybe on different levels? Like, I'm assuming there's personality wise, style of communication. Like, what are kind of the areas that
Yeah,
that
sure.
work that you can look at when you're kind of evaluating and try to figure out how
Yeah.
best to
So,
work with this?
and every tool has a different language to put around this, but ultimately, I
Sure.
think of, and I'll just start with DISC as an example. So, if you're using the DISC tool, high D personality, so drivers, dominant kind of personality. The focus is on action, and whether it's D for DISC or it's an 8 on the Enneagram or it's an ENTJ, it's roughly the same kind of behavioral pattern, right? That comes into play. And putting someone that is very focused on kind of driving towards outcomes, that's very goal oriented, that's interested in action, and putting that with someone who needs to understand the strategy, is conscientious about the details and the how about how this is going to work, oftentimes creates a lot of conflict. And I'm
Mm,
sure, if you, for your listeners, and they just heard that story, I mean, they're on one side or the other of that relationship, or have been at some points in their life, and they understand the
hmm
tension and the frustration that's come from working with someone on the other side of that equation, right? And so really what
mm,
we're doing is just delivering a ton of great insights that is contextual to the meetings that they're having with that person, or the interactions that they're having through chat systems, that really kind of help. They're nice reminders about, hey, remember you're talking to Darren. Darren's action oriented. If you're spending your whole time talking about
mm.
feelings, you know, Darren, you're probably not getting through to Darren, right? Like he needs to understand the
Right.
why, or he needs to understand like how are we going to get there and who's doing the work, and let's go do it, right?
hmm
So that's a really good kind of simple example.
What's another axis? I'm just trying to get the listeners to maybe identify or try to think of examples in their own life of either functional or dysfunctional, relationships that they've had, and maybe some ideas on how they could have made it
Yeah, well,
better,
I
I
mean,
guess, when they're
I think one
listening.
of the other things, so to kind of move away from just behavioral patterns, I think strengths. There's a lot of clashing
hmm
that occurs there because let's say just as an example, I'm not a details person, right? If you look at my strengths profile, it's very heavily focused on influence and strategic thought. And so, if you put me in a role and you're asking me to work through spreadsheets and do quality control, uh, I'm checked out. I can do that for one day, and I'm going to roll home and I'm going to be exhausted, and I'm going to hate my job. And if you're asking me to do that for weeks on end or months on end, chances are I'm checking the help wanted ads, right? Or I'm reaching out to my network and I'm saying, hey, I'm dying here, and I've got no energy even for the weekend. And that's another really good example where we're highlighting these areas of strengths, and the not necessarily weaknesses, but the alternative of that, and then we're identifying what are some of these ways that you can work with each other that really kind of leverages or plays to those strengths, as opposed to forcing people into some areas of weakness that are just going to be detrimental to their long term stability in that organization or team.
Nice. Now, can you maybe share like a story or two of when people really do understand each other? And it sounds like Cloverleaf is a tool to do so, but separate from that, maybe they use Cloverleaf, maybe they didn't. But like, where people normally who maybe wouldn't work well together, or their personalities are not the same, and so it's just challenging to understand and have empathy for the other
Yeah,
side. Do you have some stories where
yeah. Well,
that would have worked out really well,
I'll give
or
it.
that did
I'll give
work
an
out well?
example of kind of an organizational perspective. So, because it's not just individual. One of the things that we do because we're allowing people to organize themselves into teams. One of the things that you can do is get a really clear pattern of like, what's our culture. And that's a question that kind of comes into play often when we're talking about teams. So it's not just the one-on-one relationship, but it's also, hey, as
Hmm.
a team, how are we wired to work, and what are some ways that we can think about how our culture is manifested on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things that we've
Huh.
seen frequently is, especially with remote teams or teams with distributed locations. So it doesn't have to be 100% remote and people are working from home, but we've got multiple locations,
Sure.
and the Tel Aviv office behaves completely differently than the San Francisco office, right? And how do we create a culture that makes it feel like one organization if you're not all physically in the same location? And
I like
how do
that.
you do
Yeah,
that?
how do we do
So
it?
one of the things that we do is just give you a ton of visualization so you can actually put language to it, right? Hey, here's some specific behavioral patterns that this team likely follows. And then the other thing, like, so a very specific example, and I used the Tel Aviv and San Francisco cities very intentionally. We had a client that had offices in both locations, and they were literally spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to send teams to physically go work in the other office for a week or 2 weeks at a time to really try to create these opportunities for people to bump into each other and create that culture kind of across
Hmm.
locations. And what we saw is, you implement the software and you don't actually need to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to move people around the country and hotel nights and airplane tickets and etc. Because what you do is you get to a much deeper understanding of the individuals and the culture. So like a good example on the culture side is one of the values that we measure is management philosophy. How do people want to be managed, or what's their approach to managing? And it's kind of, if you think about it on a continuum, for one end it's support motivated, and I'm checking in with you, what resources do you need, I'm like very intimately involved in the work, versus the other end of that where it's like, hey, just give me the specific objectives that you want me to achieve, right? Like, oh, I need to have that piece of code delivered by the end of the week, or I need to make 5 sales
Hmm.
that exceeds $10,000 by the end of the week. And then just get out of my way, right? Like,
Right.
I don't need you to check in on me 8 times a day. I don't need a bunch of resources. If I need something, I'm going to come tell you, right? And our team, is very much support motivated, but we have one outlier on that team who happens to be our salesperson, who's very performance oriented, or goal oriented, right? And so, what does that mean in terms of how we approach our sales leader, right? And if we want to tailor style in a way that doesn't make him feel like we're micromanaging him, or we don't trust that he is able to do the job, or
Hmm.
that we're nitpicking some specific approach about how he's doing it. He just wants to let us know at the end of the week that, like, hey, I closed 6 accounts instead of 5, and then we're all going to cheer for him. And whether we're all in the same room or we're doing that over Slack and through gifts, it doesn't matter. But we understand that about him now, and we're able to kind of approach that relationship in
Hmm.
a way that's meaningful.
Hmm. It's great. Darren had told me a story about when she was, I guess, collaborate. Everyone was collaborating together, and then someone, I guess, there's someone that walked away, and she felt pretty disappointed about that. Do
Oh
you end
yeah,
to
well,
to
it
wrap it
does.
up? Would you,
Yeah, I
or
think
something
that was
like
my
this? Does that ring a
co-founder,
bell?
and we did have a
Okay.
brainstorming session specific
Oh,
about
okay.
some user flow inside the app. How are people moving from one step to the next inside the process, and what are some things that we want to do to really kind of help the user understand what's the next thing to do inside of our platform. And we generated a ton of great ideas, right? Whiteboard full of post-it notes, and or if you're talking about a remote team, this would be a whole Trello board filled up with some great ideas. And at the end of that, it was kind of like, and this is just again back to the team culture. Our team culture is, man, we really love ideas, and we get together and we can come up with 1,000 great ideas.
Hmm.
But then we walk away, and it was kind of like, oh, hey, who took notes on that? Who's going to prioritize it? How do we actually assign this out to people? And so there's like this whole back end of our process that oftentimes gets overlooked. And so that is probably specifically what she was referring to, was that specific example, but it plays out consistently with our team. So
Mhm.
the great thing about that is, because Cloverleaf has really kind of given us language to put around that, and we reinforce it through these coaching tips and insights, we're able to call that out up front and say, okay, hey, we all know that this is our pattern, right? And the chances of this being successful when we walk away from this conversation are low if we don't put that structure in up front. So we use a tool called a time timer, right, which is just a simple little stopwatch, kind of physical stopwatch.
Mhm.
And then we set time frames for each of the different parts of that process, right? We're not going to spend the whole hour brainstorming. We're going to spend 20 minutes here, then we're going to spend 20 minutes, organizing, prioritizing, working through that stuff. At the end of that 20 minutes, we're just done, right? If we didn't get to it, then that means it wasn't important enough. And then that last 20 minutes,
Nice. Sounds very Google
well,
Sprint like. Is
yeah,
that right? Is that what
I
you're
mean,
getting
I'm
at there,
sure
Will?
I don't know that
Who
I would
came up
call
with
it
the
Google
name?
Sprint, but we're definitely an agile shop. And,
Oh, okay.
we're
Mhm.
always trying to get, concepts and ideas that are working for other, agile organizations that can just help us be successful.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, but I guess how did Devin feel like after that? I guess practically speaking, you had that brainstorming session and then
Yeah, and
what
and I think
happened
maybe what she was
after
referring
that?
to was, I think Kirsten's my co-founder, and the fact that I'm using
Mhm.
this story in her name is not going to bother her. But and she regularly does this. She'll get a coaching insight from Cloverleaf, right, our own product, and it is a reminder. And I think in this example, she actually got a coaching insight on Devin that was basically like, she loves closure, right? So and she's like, oh my gosh, we just had this
Oh,
really
wow.
big
Okay.
open ended conversation, and that, I bet that was stressing her out, right? And so kind of came back to close the loop and say like, oh, hey, how did you feel about that? And then it really just kind of validated everything that Cloverleaf told her, and that she had kind of seen play out in terms of her body language and how she approached the conversation, and was really like, hey, help us get to that closure that you're looking for, right? Here's what I think is prioritization. What do you think next steps? How does this fit into the other work that we have going on? And that was super successful because, one, it included Devin in the solution, and then two, it gave her the closure that she was looking for. Right now, she had this freedom of mind share to go focus on solutions as opposed to feeling confused and frustrated over a lack of a direction.
Love it. So, for teams that aren't using Cloverleaf, how can, say I'm working on a remote team, I'm not a manager, I'm just like a developer or a designer or an HR professional, and I don't have too much sway. Like, how can I start to do a better job at understanding my colleagues, learning how to work with them better, and just having a better experience overall when working with others.
Yeah, no, I think
Assuming we
assuming you
don't
don't
have
have Cloverleaf, I
Cloverleaf.
mean, obviously you can take any of those behavioral assessments in other places. We'd recommend that you take it on Cloverleaf, but that's definitely, there are definitely other options out there, right?
But what do I do? Do I tell my colleague like, "Hey, you go do this thing too. Let's look at them
Yeah,
together."
you
Like,
could. I
what would
think
be
the
the
biggest
next
thing is
step?
just investing in relationships, right? And I think oftentimes we get so focused on,
Okay.
and I think especially for people that have behavioral patterns that, they're not more extroverted, or they're not more, open as opposed to guarded, and whatever language you want to put on that, especially for people that kind of fall into that category, right? Where it's just easier, and my natural tendencies is to focus on the work and just get the work done, right? But to be intentional about
Mhm.
creating time and space. And I think especially with remote teams, one of the things that we see is it's even more challenging for the space for those conversations to occur, right? Because you're not just, having lunch together, or you're not bumping into each other on the way to the bathroom, or the way the quote unquote proverbial water cooler. So it means you have to be even more intentional
Hmm.
about seeking out those relationships and offering ways to connect in a bigger, more meaningful way. And some of the ways that I've seen remote teams do this is,
Hmm.
think about car rides or think about regular patterns in your life. Like, hey, I'm going to go drop the kids off in the morning, and that drive back to my house is time that maybe I would just listen to the radio or I'd listen to a podcast. And it's like, hey, is this an opportunity where I could potentially invest in the relationships with my teammates and really get to know them better? So I've seen some people put out on Slack like, hey, I'm running this errand or I'm going to this location. I've got an hour in the car. Here's my number. Give me a call. Like, let's just connect. And so just making yourself open and available for those
Hmm.
relationships to get built. Because all we're doing, all Cloverleaf is really doing is just building relationships. It's making space and time for that, even when you haven't. I think the inertia of trying to, oh well, we've got to book time on the cat. Like, I find this happening in my personal life regularly, where it's like, oh, I'd really like to go hang out with these people, but they live 45 minutes away. And then the logistics of that, and I've got kids, and there's sports, and I've got this really complex social schedule, and like the inertia of just trying to
Yes.
get something on the calendar for that relationship is incredibly difficult. And then you look back and you're like, wow, we haven't seen each other in 6 months. That's a real problem. And so what we're trying to do is really kind of help you overcome the
Hmm.
inertia of that and give you those reminders about how to build better relationships with each other in a way that's going to be effective for you in a work team. But you can do that without Cloverleaf, obviously, and you just got to be much more intentional about it, especially in a remote team.
Love it. You wrote a book, Corporate Bravery, and I was going through the description, and there was something interesting that, I'm sure there's lots of interesting things, but something struck out at me. As you mentioned, there's a growing mistrust between team members and management. It resonated with me a little bit because I've worked with lots of startups where the internal politics were really, really challenging to the point where,
Sure. Yep.
the startup imploded in the worst case scenario. Can you talk a little bit about that growing mistrust that you see? Like, what was it before? What is it
Yeah, so in,
now?
in, in the
What's
book, we
causing
are
that?
taking a more macro view of kind of that trust relationship, right? So, I'm talking
Hmm.
in that book specifically more about some of the bigger structural issues that are happening in our economy that impact how we experience work on a daily basis. So, some of the bigger structural things, I'll address a couple, and then let's talk more at a micro level on the team level. But at a macro level, some of the things that we look at is
Great.
just pay disparity, right? Like, when you are looking at a CEO who's making 400 times, the average salary of the rank and file of an organization, then that will create mistrust, right? Because you're looking at
Wow.
everything that leader does through the lens of that pay disparity. And that's one example, but there's a lot of those at a macro or organizational level. When we think about that at a team level, so trust is probably the biggest determinant of a successful team, right? And what we see is teams that have a really high performance track record have really high levels of trust at a team level. And ultimately, not only is it that relationship between
Huh.
the manager and the other team members, but it's also the trust of others on the team as well, right? And oftentimes we create our own
Huh.
misconceptions or misperceptions about why someone is behaving the way they're behaving. So if we go back to the example that we talked about earlier, where we have, kind of this driver personality and we have this person who's super conscientious, it's really easy for the super conscientious person to say, oh, that driver person doesn't care about the details. They're cutting corners. They don't care about quality. They're just trying to increase their, sales performance by another 10%. Right. And those are the stories that we tell ourselves in team environments when we see certain behaviors play out. Well, the reality is, like, 9 times out of 10, or 99 times out of 100, that's not actually the case, right? It's just the behavioral patterns that we've fallen into, or something about our underlying value system, or something about how our strengths are playing out in the course of the team that are forcing certain behaviors to happen, but how you perceive that is on you, right? And if you don't have all the information about why that person is behaving that way, then it's easy for you to create your own stories and narratives around that. And that's where we see a lot of mistrust happening at the ground level between individuals on a team. And that has nothing to do with the 400x pay disparity that exists between the CEO and individuals in the organization.
Brutal. Wow. Darrin, thanks a lot for coming on the show. Super helpful stuff.
Yeah, anytime, man. Thanks for
Right
having me.
on. My pleasure. So what would you say if people want to check out, Cloverleaf or learn more about it? Here's your pitch.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously they can go to the website. It's cloverleaf.me. So I know it's a little bit different. So I'll just say it one more time: cloverleaf.me. And once you go in there, there's tons of opportunities to engage. We do offer some free assessments and the opportunity to create teams of up to 5 people. And there's premium accounts, there's small team accounts. We also offer enterprise solutions for people who maybe are more like agile coaches or coaches, that are focused on building teams or working through remote or distributed challenges. Then we have some very specific solutions for those people as well. But you can navigate through the website and see all of that and learn more.
Awesome. All right, Darrin, thank you. So everyone, from Darrin and myself, thanks for listening. And until next time, keep building those remote teams. Cheers for now. Hey listeners, we're really trying to get the message out about how remote teams can be so awesome. If you found this podcast helpful, would you take 60 seconds to leave us a review in iTunes? It helps us rank to have more people learn about this show, and it helps us know which content is the most helpful. As a thank you, I'll try to read every review on the show and give you a shout out. Thanks a lot!